It was just a couple months ago that Sigma announced that they were making not one, not two, but 9 lenses to start with for the Sony E-mount. And today we're going to be talking about the 24mm 1.4 Sigma Art for Sony E-mount. Specifically, what's it like to actually shoot with it? Here we go. This is the Sigma Art 24mm 1.4 for the Sony E-mount system. And right away, we're going to talk about some nice capabilities and features of it, some interesting quirks to the lens itself. I'm going to talk about what it was like to shoot with it. I'm going to show you some example images, and then I'm going to give it a rating. If you want to see the images up close and personal that I've shot with this lens, take a look at them later on in the video and also on my Instagram page. With that said, let's jump right into the Sigma Art 24mm 1.4 for the Sony E-mount. Some basic specs of the lens. First of all, aperture range. f1.4, of course. Stop down to f16, so pretty reasonable range there. We lose out on 22 or 29. I don't usually use those apertures, so that wasn't a thing that I felt I was missing when I was working with it. It's a 9-blade aperture, and 24mm wide angles are not particularly well known for the way they defocus background. I thought it looked fine. We really start paying attention to how many aperture blades, I think with a little bit more telephoto of focal lengths, so it looks good. It's a nice quality defocused background that you get off of it. You have some interesting additional ways that they make the lens itself. First of all, there are 2 different types of low dispersion glass inside of this lens in order to control chromatic aberration. And I have to say they worked beautifully for me. No chromatic aberration, no fringing. It really looked gorgeous all the way through the picture with the series of images that I shot. Then you have probably my favorite described feature of a lens that I've seen in a long time, and that is a thermally stable composite material. Specifically, that means, unfortunately, it doesn't mean that it came out of a superhero comic. It means that the materials that they're building it out of are designed to work the same way with the same quality and the same results in a greater range of temperatures. Now, I'm shooting this in July, so I did not have extreme heat or extreme cold that I was working with because I was at a pretty high elevation in July. So I was working between about 60 and about 75 degrees. Not a significant range of temperature, so I didn't get to test that. You also have an upgraded focusing motor inside of this. They call it a hypersonic motor. More on focusing in a little bit. So some interesting features that they put into the lens. What's not in the lens? Well, specifically there are 3 things we've come to kind of look for in a lens that we didn't have here. The first, of course, is weather sealing. Now, this is not news. The Sigma Art series traditionally does not have weather sealing. It's something that they've removed from their lens design in order to control cost. The next thing is there's no stabilization inside of the lens. No stabilization at all. More on that in a little bit. Those 2 things we were kind of wishing would happen, but we didn't expect for them to happen when Sony was allowing other manufacturers to start making some lenses for this system. But we expected that out of the Sigma system. Lastly, if you look at the press announcements, if you look at the descriptions that they have of this, you'll find that they dance around the word native. Native does not just mean it mounts onto a camera system. Instead, what it means is it's designed for that camera system to be able to work with all of its capabilities. And this is not that. This lens, if you ever, and you should do this at some point, take one of these and put it next to a 24mm for Canon, you'll find that from here up it looks exactly the same. What does it look like they did? It looks like they took the Canon version of the lens and just built an MC11 adapter into the base. And every single one of these that's out so far looks that way. The 85, the 50, the 35, the 24, and the 20 all look that way. So that means that it's not designed for the Sony system, it's adapting to it. Now, this is going to affect how fast it responds to the Sony focusing system, which works differently than mirrored SLRs like Canon or Nikon. I found this to work well. It's going to be interesting testing these focal lengths as they get larger. But right now with the 24, I found it fast, I found it responsive, I found it accurate, and I found it reliable. It did what I asked it to do. It did it every time. So I was really comfortable with the focusing system off of this, even knowing it's not a native lens. I've used MC11 and Metabones adapters with Canon lenses on Sony cameras many times before. I found this to be a very smooth operation. As the lenses scale up in focal length, it'll be interesting to see what happens. What else is really nice about it? Well, if you take a look at the lens, first of all, it's a really nice construction. It feels nice and weighted in the hand. It feels good. It feels like a quality build. I like the material. I like the way that it works. I like the size of the manual focus ring. And I like the throw, which is reasonable. Otherwise, printed right on there, you have both the focusing distance. We see that in a lot of lenses, not as many as I would like, but a lot of them. But more importantly, right below it, they actually list hyperfocal information. So there's hyperfocal information that's actually printed on this, showing specifically f8 and f16. If you're doing hyperfocal calculation, you're probably not brighter than f8, and this lens does not stop down past f16, so those numbers make sense. They don't print f11 on it, I guess, to save space, but it does have a hyperfocal calculator. Not enough lenses have that these days. I'm glad that this does, because if you think about it, it kind of needs it. 24 millimeters is a wide angle that is used predominantly for landscape shooting. I don't usually shoot groups at 24 millimeter. I'm more likely to shoot that at 35 or with a 24 to 70. It's not quite wide enough for most astrophotography work. We don't shoot real portraits with it. It is a landscape and travel lens. So those are the situations when we use hyperfocal calculations the most as photographers. I'm glad to see that it has it, which is really nice. So other things that I found in the image, contrast was good off of the images itself. The center, when I did grab focus accurately, looked really good. But I'll tell you, I was missing the stabilizer. I was missing that a lot. And I'm going to show you some images in a little bit where I shot several images in a row at a 60th of a second, which for 24 millimeter, I should easily be able to hand hold. And yet I was getting pretty significant motion blur in a way that I don't when I shoot with my 55 millimeter or my 85 millimeter, especially at focal lengths double, especially at shutter speeds double the focal length. So that was interesting, and it happened a few times. You've really got to be stable with this lens, particularly if you're with a high resolution camera. And I am shooting on a A7R Mark III, so I'm shooting a relatively high camera with this. It held up to the resolution of the camera beautifully. But I don't think that it really held up particularly well outside of the center. I'm going to show you some example images in a little bit, showing multiple times in multiple images that I'm losing a significant amount of sharpness off of this lens as I approach the edges. And typically with an art series lens, particularly with a lens where we're shooting landscape, that's why we make the sacrifices and lose weather sealing, lose stabilization, so that we can actually get this premium glass at a reasonable price. And I didn't get that the way that I was expecting off of this lens, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So I want to show you those kind of things. So there's going to be some example images we're going to do here. So first, what I want to do is I want to show you what I mean by this lack of sharpness in the corners. I shot two images back to back on a tripod, and I shot them with the 24 millimeter Sigma and the 16 to 35 f4 Sony lens. And you would expect the prime to hold up to greater scrutiny. So let's take a look at that right now.
What we're going to do is take a look at two images Both of them shot back to back on a tripod. And this first one is with the 16 to 35 f4. And as we can look at the center, it looks exactly the way I would expect. It was well centered and well focused there. And then we're going to move over to the side, and it held up to the sides, I think, reasonably well. And it actually held up on both sides, but we can notice it more on camera right. And what we're going to do now is look at the Sigma 24 millimeter 1.4 and notice that the center looks perfectly good again. And then what we're going to do is move over to the side with significant loss, I feel. More than I expected, actually.
So I wasn't really thrilled with that result, especially shooting on a prime. I actually prefer shooting on primes, and I do so because I like the general clarity and crispness and contrast that they tend to provide. And while I found this to be very sharp in the center and have good contrast and have a good focusing operation, I was not thrilled with the way that the sides looked off of this lens. So now what I'd like to do is take you through several images that I shot with it and examine those in detail and kind of talk you through what that experience was like.
So here we've got a sunset picture, and I bring it in to show that I really do think this lens records color beautifully. I had no chromatic aberration to speak of, and it recorded enough contrast, detail, and color that I could really go in and do any kind of editing work that I wanted to with the image. And that showcased just how much information they really can record with their glass quality. With this one, I wanted to show that when you focus in the center, it really is beautifully sharp. Lots of detail, lots of texture at the point of focus. But here, as a counterpoint, we've got these trees that really are equidistant from the camera, and I focused in the center of the frame. But as I move towards the top, which corresponds to camera right with the maroon bells shot, I am losing information, I think, noticeably. And when I move towards the bottom, which is going to correspond to camera left in the maroon bells shot, the same thing happens. And I think slightly more at what is the top part of this particular frame, more so than I would have expected. Now, this next image is actually an interesting result. I'm shooting at a 60th of a second, obviously 24 millimeter, so I should be able to handhold this. But this first image really did have some motion blur to it, more than I would have expected at this focal length. As soon as I shot it a couple times, of course, I was able to get one here in the second result that didn't have motion blur, but the lens motion blurred more easily than I was anticipating, and that was an interesting result. I'm not sure why. Lastly, I want to show that you really can do astrophotography with this lens. Now, this is about 3 minutes of time, so there's a little bit of motion blur to it, but you can get good results.
So those are some images that I shot, and I definitely had some pros and some cons working with this lens. But now that we've shot with it, now that we have seen some example images off of it, we can ask some very important questions regarding this lens. And afterwards, we're going to give it a totally important and not at all arbitrary rating. About a third. Yes. Yes.
We are going to start with the beginner category here. And first, we're going to look at ease of use. Well, it's a prime lens, so I'm going to give it 3 out of 5. Size and weight. This is a Sigma Art lens. They're pretty big, so I'm going to give it a 2 out of 5. Flexibility, again, it's a prime lens, so 2 out of 5. Now, growth potential is the flip side there, and I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 because I think that new photographers should use prime lenses, and shooting with a wide angle would be very useful for them. This is a Sigma Art lens, which are very cool right now, so it gets a 4 out of 5 in coolness, and it does get one additional extra bonus point for dopeness, bringing its beginner usage total to 16 out of 25. Coming to the enthusiast categories, its build quality is still solid and nice and tough, but it doesn't have weather sealing to it, so I'm giving it a 4 out of 5. Image quality is good, but not spectacular. I'm giving it a 3 out of 5. Speed, I actually found this to be relatively fast despite my reservations at the beginning because it's not a native lens, so it gets a 4 out of 5. Features, no weather sealing, it has no stabilization, it gets a 2 out of 5. Value as a result of all of these gets a 3 out of 5, bringing its enthusiast total to 16. Since it's the first lens that I am reviewing, it really has nothing to compare it to, but it's interesting that it got a 16 out of 25 in both categories through nothing but sheer coincidence.
So that is the Sigma Art 24mm 1.4 for Sony mount. What do I think? It's a good lens. It's not a great lens. And I really wanted it to be a great lens. I've got some features that I feel are missing. I've got some construction I feel is great. I've got some optical issues that maybe it's my copy that I was working with. Maybe it's not. The price is really attractive for a high quality prime lens, but how often do I really need it? 24mm is not something I shoot a group with. It's not something I do a portrait with. It's not wide enough for astrophotography. It's a landscape lens. And a landscape lens as a portrait lens needs to be really stellar in order to beat even the 16-35 f4, which I don't think it did here. And interestingly, if I'm shooting a really nice landscape, do I need f1.4? I'm probably shooting that f8 to f11 anyway. So why the size? Why the weight? Again, it's a good lens. It's a tricky lens, and I think it's for a very specific audience. Anyway, I hope that this was useful. I hope it was helpful or at least entertaining. If you want to see the images from it, please check out my Instagram page or Facebook. Of course, please subscribe. I'm going to be doing a whole lot of talking about camera news and lens reviews. And of course, have a wonderful day. Happy shooting. Thanks.